I thought I was just visiting my friend, until his mom smiled at me in a way that made my heart stop. The first time I met her, I didn't realize how much it would change my perspective. I had gone over to my friend's house for a simple reason, maybe to borrow notes, work on a project, or just hang out after school. I expected the usual casual greetings, the familiar cluttered living room, and the hum of a television somewhere in the background. What I didn't expect was her. She was in the kitchen when I arrived, arranging a few things on the counter. There was a quiet elegance in the way she moved, deliberate but unhurried. Even from across the room, I noticed how the sunlight caught strands of her hair, giving it a subtle glow, and how her eyes held a warmth that made the space feel softer. I couldn't tell if it was the way she smiled at me or the calm, steady tone of her voice, but something in me shifted. When she greeted me, her hand brushed lightly against mine in the most casual way, guiding me toward a chair. It was brief, almost imperceptible, yet I felt the echo of that touch linger far longer than it should have. She had a quiet confidence, the kind that doesn't demand attention but draws it naturally. I felt awkward, fumbling for words, and even my friend noticed my hesitation with a knowing smirk I couldn't quite read. Her words were simple, friendly, asking about school, what I had been up to, yet there was a subtle undertone I couldn't place. A teasing lilt in her voice, a pause that felt unusually deliberate. I caught myself staring for a fraction too long, and immediately chastised myself, reminding myself she was my friend's mom. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that she noticed me noticing her. I remember the faint scent she wore, a mix of something floral, warm, and familiar, that made the kitchen feel simultaneously ordinary and entirely captivating. Even the ordinary act of her handing me a glass of water seemed charged with a curious energy, the cool glass touching my palms in contrast with the warmth of her fingers brushing mine. That evening, I left the house with a strange mixture of guilt, curiosity, and exhilaration. I told myself it was nothing, an innocent first impression. But deep down, I knew something had shifted. There was a subtle awareness, a quiet tension that I couldn't ignore. And though I didn't understand it fully yet, I felt the story of us, whatever us might eventually become, beginning to take its first, tentative steps. After that first encounter, I found myself thinking about her more often than I cared to admit. Visits to my friend's house, which used to feel casual and routine, suddenly carried a subtle weight of anticipation. I tried to focus on homework or video games, but there was always that quiet awareness, her presence lingering at the edge of my thoughts. It was during one of these visits that I noticed her in a new way. She was sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through a cookbook, her brow furrowed slightly in concentration. The sunlight streamed in through the window, highlighting the curve of her cheek and the warm undertone of her skin. Even the smallest movement seemed to draw my attention, the way her fingers brushed the pages, the way her hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders, and the faint, comforting scent she carried with her, something floral, like a quiet garden in bloom. She looked up and caught my gaze. There was a brief pause, long enough for my stomach to tighten and my mind to stutter. Then, she smiled, just a little, as if she were sharing a secret I wasn't supposed to understand. Her voice, calm and melodic, asked about my day, my plans, even my dreams. I noticed the way her eyes softened when she listened, how she leaned slightly forward as if she genuinely wanted to understand me. It was unnerving and thrilling all at once. In that moment, I became painfully aware of how close she was when handing me a book or a pen. Her fingers brushed mine ever so slightly, and my heart thumped audibly in my chest. I tried to remind myself that she was my friend's mom, that there were boundaries I wasn't supposed to cross. But the way she looked at me, lingering, assessing, almost amused, made it difficult to think rationally. She teased me occasionally, in ways that were gentle but deliberate. "You look so serious when you concentrate," she said one afternoon, brushing a stray strand of hair behind her ear. It was a compliment, yes, but there was something more in her tone, a subtle acknowledgement that she noticed me in ways others didn't. I found myself responding with nervous laughter, aware of how flustered I was becoming. That day, as I left her house, I realized I was no longer just visiting for homework or friendship. Something was shifting. I was curious about her, truly curious, and I wanted to be around her more, to see the way she moved, to hear the warmth in her voice, to feel the quiet electricity in those fleeting touches. The slow burn of awareness had begun, and it was impossible to ignore. It happened one quiet afternoon, almost by accident. I had gone over to my friend's house, thinking it would be a simple visit, maybe some homework, maybe just hanging out with my friend. But she was there, as usual, moving around the house with that effortless grace that seemed to make everything else fade into the background. We ended up in the kitchen together, alone for the first time without the casual noise of a group around us. I was trying to carry some groceries from the car when she reached out to steady a bag that tipped slightly, and our hands brushed. Just for a moment. And yet, in that simple touch, something shifted. It wasn't overwhelming, but it lingered, a spark that I wasn't quite ready to name. "Careful," she said, her voice soft, almost teasing, but with a warmth that sent a jolt through me. Her eyes met mine, steady and assessing, and for a moment I couldn't look away. There was a quiet understanding in her gaze, a subtle acknowledgement that went beyond the casual politeness of neighborly conversation. I felt exposed in a way that was thrilling and confusing all at once. As we worked side by side, she began talking about small things, the week's errands, a recipe she had been trying, little memories from her day. But there was a layer underneath, a gentle curiosity in the way she asked about me, about my life, my thoughts. "You seem different than the other boys your age," she said casually, yet her words carried weight. I didn't know how to respond, caught somewhere between flattery, embarrassment, and an unspoken tension I didn't yet fully understand. Her presence was intoxicating in its subtlety. The warmth of her shoulder brushing mine as we reached for the same bowl, the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the sunlight that spilled through the window, the soft timbre of her laughter echoing lightly in the kitchen, all of it left me dizzy in a way I couldn't rationalize. I realized then that I was noticing everything about her, the small, graceful gestures, the way she leaned slightly closer when explaining something, the quiet confidence in her voice. And when she offered a fleeting, almost conspiratorial smile, my chest tightened. For a moment, I felt that delicate tension, an awareness of attraction, a curiosity about the depth of her attention, a silent question lingering in the air between us. By the time I left that afternoon, I was certain of something I couldn't put into words: she had noticed me. In a way that mattered. And for the first time, I found myself hoping, quietly, that I would see her like that again. Not just as my friend's mom, but as someone who had suddenly made the ordinary world feel charged with possibility. After that quiet confession in passing, I couldn't stop replaying the moments in my mind. Her gaze, her smile, the gentle brush of her hand, all of it lingered far longer than it should have. Every visit to my friend's house now carried a subtle, unspoken tension. I found myself acutely aware of her presence, noticing the way she moved, the softness in her voice, the warmth that seemed to radiate from her. But alongside the thrill, there was a gnawing hesitation. She was my friend's mother, a woman I was supposed to respect and admire from a distance. And yet, the feelings I was beginning to recognize weren't easily ignored. I would catch myself staring too long when she leaned over to show me something, my hand brushing hers by accident, or perhaps not entirely by accident. My mind would race, torn between desire and propriety, curiosity and guilt. She noticed it, of course. Subtle things betrayed my unease, a slight blush when our hands met, the way I would stumble over words, the nervous laugh I couldn't quite suppress. And she seemed to enjoy it, though never in a way that felt predatory. There was a quiet playfulness in her attentiveness, a teasing glimmer in her eyes, as if she were carefully exploring the boundaries between us. One afternoon, while helping her rearrange some books in the living room, our hands brushed again. This time, I didn't pull away immediately. She let her fingers linger for a moment longer than necessary, and I felt a strange warmth spread through me. "You're getting too serious," she said softly, a knowing smile tugging at her lips. The words were casual, but the way she said them made my chest tighten. It was impossible to tell whether she was teasing or acknowledging something unspoken, and that uncertainty thrilled and terrified me at the same time. Every interaction became a delicate dance. Simple gestures, handing her a cup of tea, brushing against her shoulder, sharing a quiet laugh, carried weight I hadn't anticipated. I was learning how to navigate the intensity of attraction while holding back, trying to respect the invisible line between what was permissible and what my heart desperately wanted. By the end of that visit, I realized something important: my feelings were no longer casual. I was drawn to her in ways that went far beyond admiration. And though I didn't fully understand it yet, I knew I would have to wrestle with these emotions carefully, learning to balance desire, respect, and the fragile tension that now defined every lingering glance, every accidental touch, every quiet moment we shared. It was one of those quiet evenings when everything seemed to slow down. I had gone over to my friend's house again, ostensibly for a casual hangout, but somehow, as usual, it ended up being just the two of us for a few moments. She had a calm presence that seemed to fill the room, making ordinary moments feel charged with quiet significance. We ended up in the living room, sitting close enough that our shoulders occasionally brushed. I was helping her sort through some old photographs, laughing at memories neither of us had lived but could imagine vividly. And then, in a shift that caught me off guard, she grew quiet, her gaze softening, her hands folding gently in her lap. "I sometimes feel invisible," she admitted, her voice almost a whisper. "Like people don't really see me anymore." There was no accusation in her tone, only quiet honesty, and I felt my chest tighten. I wanted to comfort her, to bridge that gap between us, to let her know that I saw her, truly saw her, in a way that was safe and sincere. I reached out, almost instinctively, letting my hand brush hers. The touch was brief, tentative, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned slightly into it, as if the contact were an anchor in the sea of her vulnerability. I could feel the warmth of her skin, the steadiness of her pulse, and it was grounding in a way I hadn't anticipated. As she spoke about her fears, her regrets, and the small moments of loneliness that life sometimes brings, I listened intently. Every word, every pause, every trembling laugh added layers to my understanding of her. I realized that the attraction I felt wasn't just physical, it was rooted in empathy, respect, and genuine care. I wanted to be near her, not just for the thrill of proximity, but because her emotions mattered to me. The subtle tension between us didn't disappear, it was still there, in the brief lingering of her hand against mine, in the quiet way she looked at me, in the warmth of her presence. But it had changed. It had become deeper, richer, and safer. The slow burn attraction was no longer just curiosity or excitement, it was intimacy in its most human form. When the moment passed, we shared a quiet, understanding smile, a silent acknowledgement of what had shifted. I left that evening with a new awareness: the bond between us was growing, delicate but undeniable. The slow burn was evolving into something far more profound than fleeting desire, it was connection, trust, and the beginning of a story neither of us fully understood, yet both of us wanted to explore. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the house seemed almost suspended in stillness. I had stopped by my friend's home, expecting another casual visit, but this time, we found ourselves alone. She was in the living room, organizing a few papers, and when I entered, she looked up with that same gentle, knowing smile. There was a subtle intensity in her gaze, one that made my chest tighten instantly. We talked about small things at first, school, projects, and mutual friends, but there was an unspoken tension in the air, a quiet pull that neither of us could ignore. Her eyes lingered on mine longer than necessary, and when she reached across the table to hand me a pen, her fingers brushed mine just slightly, deliberately. The simple contact made my pulse quicken, and for a moment, I felt completely exposed, as if she could read every thought racing through my mind. "I've always found you appealing," she said softly, almost as if testing the waters. The words weren't loud, and they weren't forceful, but they carried a weight I wasn't expecting. I froze, my throat dry, unsure of how to respond. Her vulnerability was raw, yet wrapped in a quiet confidence, and I realized that she was trusting me with something deeply personal. I wanted to speak, to say something that wouldn't ruin the fragile tension, but instead, I let the silence stretch, savoring the moment. My hand hovered near hers, wanting to close the gap without overstepping, wanting to acknowledge her without breaking the delicate boundary. She noticed, of course, and her faint smile deepened, almost as if she understood exactly what I was feeling. There was warmth in the way she leaned slightly closer, the faint scent of her perfume brushing against me, and the gentle timbre of her voice when she added, "I hope this doesn't make things awkward." But it didn't. Instead, the room felt charged with quiet possibility. The slow-burn tension we had been nurturing over weeks, the lingering glances, the accidental touches, the shared laughter and small vulnerabilities, crystallized in that moment. I realized then that what we felt wasn't fleeting or superficial. It was a connection that blended admiration, desire, and emotional intimacy. There was no rush, no need to act impulsively. Instead, we allowed ourselves to exist in that quiet space, savoring the closeness, the unspoken understanding, the mutual acknowledgement of something forbidden yet profoundly human. By the time I left that evening, my mind was awash with awareness. The attraction was undeniable, yes, but so was the trust, the respect, and the intimacy that had blossomed quietly between us. The slow burn was at its peak, and I knew that the next steps, however tentative, would be guided by care, patience, and an ever-deepening emotional bond. The next visit felt different from all the others. There was a quiet anticipation in the air, a shared understanding that something unspoken between us had shifted. I walked into the house, and she was there, casually arranging flowers on the kitchen counter, her movements as graceful as ever. But this time, our eyes met, and there was no hesitation, only recognition of the connection we had been nurturing for weeks. We spent the afternoon together, helping with small tasks around the house. Every gesture, every glance, carried the weight of familiarity and affection. When our hands brushed as we passed items back and forth, neither of us recoiled. Instead, we allowed the touch to linger, a small but deliberate acknowledgement of closeness. The warmth of her presence was steady, grounding, and comforting, filling me with a sense of belonging I hadn't realized I craved. At one point, we found ourselves sitting side by side on the couch, sharing a quiet moment of laughter over a shared memory. Her shoulder brushed mine lightly, and I felt an almost electric warmth spread through me, not from desire, but from the intimacy of being truly seen. She looked at me with a gentle smile, her eyes reflecting a mixture of amusement, understanding, and quiet fondness. It was the kind of look that spoke volumes without a single word being spoken. "I've enjoyed getting to know you, in ways I didn't expect," she admitted softly, her hand briefly resting near mine on the armrest. There was honesty in her voice, a vulnerable sincerity that made me want to reassure her, to offer comfort and companionship in equal measure. I felt the same, my admiration and affection for her had grown into something profound, anchored in both respect and deep emotional connection. The afternoon stretched on, punctuated by shared glances, light touches, and comfortable silence. We didn't rush, didn't need to define what we were yet. Instead, we simply existed in the quiet warmth of mutual understanding. The slow-burn tension that had threaded through our previous encounters had blossomed into a secure, tender bond, one that allowed us to explore our feelings while respecting boundaries and the world around us. By the time I left, I felt an overwhelming sense of contentment. Our relationship had evolved, subtly yet profoundly. We had acknowledged the attraction, explored the emotional depth, and found a way to connect that was both thrilling and safe. The story of us wasn't defined by impulsive actions or reckless passion, it was defined by trust, care, and the quiet joy of being seen and understood. As I stepped outside into the fading light, I realized that this was only the beginning. But for the first time, I felt certain that our connection, nurtured patiently and tenderly, could grow into something lasting, meaningful, and profoundly human. If this story made your heart race and left you wanting more, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a slow burn romance that lingers long after the video ends. Share your thoughts in the comments, I'd love to hear which moment captivated you the most.